Jeff Cowan, former Dean of the Annenberg School and the Director of the Center for Communication Leadership and Policy. And the Annenberg School, along with the Price School and Dornsight, with the Unruh Center, all have been putting on this program, weekly program called Road to the White House. And we're getting close to the end of that road. But as we do it, it's been about a lot of political issues. And as you know, many of you have been regulars in those conversations. We try to have discussions, not debates, and we try to cover state issues as well as national issues and do it. Today's discussion, which is really about trafficking, will be led by Mark Latinero, who is the research director of the Center for Communication Leadership and Policy and a research professor at the Annenberg School. It's a special interest of our centers, this area of trafficking, because about 2 years ago, at the invitation of the State Department, we started to explore ways in which technology could be used to combat trafficking. Of course, it's been used to facilitate human trafficking, and we want to find ways in which it could be used to combat human trafficking. Mark has led that effort, written important reports, been part of some important state convenings, work that's gone on with State Attorney General, with the State Department, USAID, and internationally, and actually had an important role in the announcement that President Clinton made a couple of weeks ago, that President Obama made a couple of weeks ago at the Clinton Global Initiative meeting. So we think this is a very appropriate topic, and I'm delighted that the panelists have agreed to be here, including Chris Kelly, who's the author of this initiative. So Mark Latinero, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for coming. When you came through the door and maybe at your seats, you saw a sort of printout of what essentially you would see walking into the ballot booth with regard to Proposition 35. And I don't know about you, but when you're there and you're looking at these sort of the voter guide and such, it's really hard to get a sense of what's really going on with initiatives and ballots. And so, I mean, imagine if you were at the voting booth, you're looking at this proposition, and said to yourself, wouldn't it be great to actually attend a forum for an hour long and get transported to this forum and learn from the experts, actually not only the experts, the principals involved in leading this initiative and people with other points of view, and learn about this issue, and then somehow get transported back to that moment and make your decision. And that's where we are today, and that's what we're here for. And I can think of no other people to help us guide us through this, not debate, but this sort of exploration of this topic than my fellow panelists here. To my left is Chris Kelly, a former Chief Privacy Officer at Facebook, founder of Safer California Foundation, and really the principal driving force of Prop 35, and it's a pleasure to have him here. To Chris's left is Delita Miller. She is a trafficking survivor herself and a mother of a trafficking survivor too. And she's really devoted her life to this issue as an advocate, and she currently works at Saving Innocents, a very important NGO here in Los Angeles. And to my right is John Vanek, retired lieutenant, San Jose Police Department, former head of the San Jose Human Trafficking Task Force, one of a number of very important task forces around our country, and has worked in many different capacities and is here to talk about Prop 35 as well. So let's begin. Chris, why is this proposition on the ballot in the first place? What inspired you to put it there? And, what inspired you to put, I think NPR reported, over $2 million of your own money into this, this campaign?
I've been very happy to support this campaign. It's actually the continuation of work that I did at Facebook in part, and also the continuation of very hard work that Daphne Fung and the organization California Against Slavery have been trying to do since 2009. There are really sort of three principal authors of what's now Prop 35. Daphne, myself, and Charmaine Bach, who's been one of the leaders in the anti-trafficking crusade out of the Alameda County DA's office. And Charmaine and Daphne have been working very hard in the legislature over the last 5 years to make some of the changes that we've put in Prop 35, including changing state laws so that you no longer have to prove physical force for minors who are engaged in sex trafficking to prove that, including the changes on fines to discourage the economically motivated trafficking that goes on, both sex and labor trafficking. And also the online piece is where I've been most involved, running privacy, safety, and security for Facebook for 4 years, and joining the company just as we were about to expand from colleges into high schools. We were very concerned that the internet had been misused in a variety of ways for a variety of illicit purposes, including human trafficking. And so we went out to design a way to verify identity more effectively and to fight this. And so I spent a lot of time with AGs across the nation, with law enforcement across the world, thinking about the ways that that various predators would try to attack youth online and how we could discourage that, including, most importantly, I think, real-world identity and the end of anonymity on Facebook. We don't, I believe there's a constitutional right to anonymity on the internet. I don't believe there's a constitutional right to anonymity everywhere. And so we made a decision as a private business that I think has, one of the main reasons that Facebook has succeeded is that it became a safer site because we were able to identify people and to engage in a number of other work with law enforcement and planning. And so part of Prop 35 is requiring all registered sex offenders to report their internet handles as well as their physical address. If Megan's laws were passed today, that would certainly be included. I did this first with Andrew Cuomo in New York State when he was Attorney General. It's been responsible for the removal of more than 25,000 convicted sex offenders from online sites, including Facebook and MySpace and a number of others. It's been phenomenally successful. I tried to get that done in the legislature here, and they didn't want to move it. They said it might cost some money, even though the LA Sheriff's lobbyist was testifying with me, saying, I've taken these 290 registrations, that's the code of the penal code, that's about sex offender registration, and it's another field in the database. All it is collecting information. It's clearly easy to do, and but they didn't want to do it for various ideological reasons. So I said, well, we're going to put it on the ballot. Daphne and I were introduced by my good friend Sarah Harbaugh, who had known Daphne through a variety of channels, and we got together and put Prop 35 on the ballot.
John, making the internet safer from sexual predators, increasing fines for human traffickers. How could anyone be against this?
Well, against those two things, on the face of it, you can't be. And I think you raise a really good point. When you look at what the ballot looks like, who can oppose this? And certainly who would oppose any form of slavery or exploitation? But we have to go deeper into the initiative, I believe, and look at all of the other impacts. And I'd like to preface this, Mark, by first thanking you for having this discussion. Thank you for hosting, and thank you for the work that you're doing in terms of technology in response to trafficking. That's an area that hadn't been touched on until you guys took it on. But I'd like to just preface everything I say with a little bit of background. Since 2006, in 2006, I became responsible for the Human Trafficking Task Force in San Jose Police Department. We were responsible for the 4 South Bay counties, federally funded to work with federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, federal and local victim service providers, advocates, legislators, policy drafters, etc. And when we look overall at this initiative, there are a couple areas where collectively, my colleagues across the state, where we have some real issues with it. Now, speaking, we can get there, I'm sure we will, but I actually think that of all of the elements that are touched upon in Prop 35, the online, the data going into the 290 registrant fields and the database, that's great, okay? If you are a convicted sex registrant, having your ISP information, your online identifiers, that's great. So we have issues, though, when we start talking about the fine structure. The fine structure, so currently, under current law, and another thing I'd like to try, I'm going to try and educate everybody along the way, because frankly, most of us really don't understand the status of the current law. In 2005, a comprehensive piece of legislation was passed by the legislature, the California Trafficking Victims Protection Act, also known as Assembly Bill 22. And it created a way for victims to receive wages owed, restitution, damages from their traffickers. And it actually allows like triple damages. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but it becomes very complicated. But what it does is it places the victim's rights and the access to money ahead of law enforcement. Prop 35, one of the things we'll do is it creates a fine structure up front. The fines would be imposed by a judge against a trafficker upon conviction. Now, there's some confusion because in a case like that, the wages performed, or the wages owed somebody for their work, and please understand that when we're talking about human trafficking, we're talking about some type of labor exploitation. It doesn't really matter in terms of in defining that exploitation if you are picking fruit, picking vegetables, working in a sweatshop as a domestic servant, or being pimped and prostituted on the street or the internet. When we look at your wages owed, we have to look at the work you performed. And we try to help a survivor move forward in their life by first off just recognizing that they performed labor that they needed to be compensated for. Under current law, you can get much higher damages than you'll be able to under the proposition. But more importantly, what this does is it allows this fine structure. Money can go and pay for the victim only for the actual wages worked, and then the rest of the fine gets split. 30% goes to the law enforcement agencies that were involved in the prosecution and the investigation of that particular case. This other 70% is going to be broadly distributed through a grant operation through the California Emergency Management Agency to this sort of, to anti-human trafficking service providers and non-governmental organizations, which is a very broad spectrum. We really don't know exactly what that includes. But what this all does is it places the focus on prosecution. It diverts money that would go to these fines that is not available to a victim afterwards when they go and have a civil proceeding against their trafficker saying, wait a minute, I don't want just the minimum wage for my hours worked. I want triple that. I want restitution. I want pain and suffering. So 35 places a focus on the prosecution piece as opposed to being victim-centered and really placing the needs of the victims first.
Delita, speaking from your sort of powerful experience and such, do you think the current law is adequate enough, and do you think that we need Proposition 35?
Current law, absolutely not. I, unfortunately, have had the opportunity under two circumstances to be involved in human trafficking as a parent. First, the first case was against a trafficker, a pimp, who had been pimping my minor daughter. He was a gang member. As a result of that, I remember after coming home from a preliminary hearing, which this pimp, who was 21 years old, posted $1 million bail, being told that my family and I had to relocate from our home. And I had about 2 or 3 hours to pack up my 2 children and my grandson and leave. There were no victim services given to us. There was no victim specialist. We called around to different nonprofits trying to get assistance. This was really before I had begun working in the human trafficking population, so I wasn't really aware of the different resources and nonprofits. However, my family and I had to scrape up money and borrow money from other family members and friends to just pay for motel rooms for about 4 or 5 months while we were awaiting trial, and the fact that this individual was a gang member who knew where we lived. So what Prop 35 does with its fines and with the 70%, I would like to speak on the 70% that Mr. I'm sorry, how do you print? Vanek spoke of. And I will give it to you from a parental perspective, okay? You're a parent. You have your home. You have your monthly expenses. all of a sudden, one day someone comes and says, you have to leave. You're not prepared for that financially. I'm a single mom of 5 children. You know, I'm not prepared for that. What do you do? What can you do? What can you do for me? You need my daughter, not need, but it's important for my daughter's testimony in this case. But our safety and well-being is on the line. To this day, we haven't received victim services. What Prop 35 does in that 70% is that, I understand it's broad, but what that does is it gives us an ability to possibly have a fund so when girls are rescued, they will have somewhere safely for them as well as their families. My daughter had a family. She didn't, to take her away from us wasn't great for her emotional, gain. From a service provider's perspective, I am the Family Support and Outreach Coordinator at Saving Innocence. One of the hardest issues that we have is funding. There are lots of services that the girls need, but because, every time, what do we hear? We don't have the funding. There's no, where to take the girls. So what Prop 35 does, it provides an avenue to help victims and to help service providers provide services for those victims. So that's my take with regards to that.
Chris, stories like Delita's are so powerful. How did you go about sort of crafting the content of Proposition 35 itself, and what else sort of, really dig deep into these stories and meet folks and to inspire you to?
Absolutely. Daphne and Charmaine had been on the streets for years. I had talked with a number of trafficking victims in my capacity in my job at Facebook. But as we really began to craft the initiative, what we heard overwhelmingly from victims was the current system doesn't work. What Shared Hope International, which has done a national survey of anti-sex trafficking laws, found that California deserved an F on its trafficking laws. The bureaucratic process of AB 22, where a trafficking victim has to prove up wages and damages and file suit and go through years and years of process in a backward court system, is something that just doesn't work. I mean, I don't know, do we have an aggregate amount that's been recovered under AB 22 at this point? I don't know of a single case that I've seen where people have recovered wages through AB 22. We wanted to have a comprehensive approach that provided an economic disincentive to traffickers. As we see increasing movement of criminal gangs into both labor and sex trafficking, because you can sell a human being over and over and over again, whereas you can only sell drugs once. We wanted to provide an aggressive deterrent and to have a comprehensive strategy that included victim services and that was, informed by deep input by victims' organizations. And we didn't talk to everyone, and for that I apologize to John Vanek, but we talked to a lot of different people, and we think this is a comprehensive, well thought out, what will be a successful approach in actually deterring and prosecuting human trafficking in this state.
If Chris was to have talked to you, John, what would you have said about what the sort of street level impact? I mean, as a law Proposition 35 on your work and on the people that you sort of are directly impacted about this issue.
Well, and I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to meet on this. Really, I mean, that's really probably one of the greatest tragedies in this whole story that we're currently talking about in the proposition. I would have loved to have met Chris until prior to today, and in fact, Chris and I were interviewed separately, but we were on a radio program this past week in San Francisco, and you brought up that question about civil judgments, and so I reached out to my colleagues, and I'm happy to give you a lot of information because I got a lot back, but we're probably looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, give or take, civil judgments under both California code and also federal code in California since the creation of the law in 2006. Now that might not sound like a lot, but understand, please, that when California law was created, there was no mechanism to really push out and say, now create the response. And in fact, it wasn't until 3 years ago that the state put any money into actually responding to human trafficking, sort of at the law enforcement standpoint. They took federal stimulus money. They created a grant program to give additional funding to the existing 6 federally funded task forces in California. We've had those task forces in San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland, San Diego, Orange County, and Los Angeles. They then created 3 additional task forces in Riverside, Fresno, and Sacramento. They also then funded another $1.2 million program to create a human trafficking of minors course, which is now offered 18 times across the state. We've been doing it for 2 years. We're funded for another 2 years. For law enforcement, service providers, academics, students, community members, anybody who wants to come to this class, it's free. So what I would have said is the number of people who are true experts in this field in California is actually quite small. We've all had some connection with the Attorney General's work group that she put together this year. 3 meetings across the state. And when you look at the list of subject matter experts that were invited and participated from a variety of sectors, it came down to about 100 people. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need other voices that are not subject matter experts. It does not mean that we do not need to hear from the community. Absolutely. Because that helps gain traction. It helps motivate local law enforcement agencies to say, hey, you know what? This is an important issue in my town because my citizens are telling me, if I'm the chief of police, that we need to take it on. But what I would have asked is that these people would have been invited to the table. In Daphne's defense, I have tremendous admiration for her passion and her commitment. 3 years ago, she came to me and said, hey, John, what do you think we should do with this? You know, what's your opinions on it? And I said, well, you know what? I don't think that raising sentencing is an effective crime prevention strategy. It certainly works to cut down recidivism while traffickers are in jail. But when she has gone out and asked for input from many of the experts said, Daphne, we think you're approaching this in the wrong way. We think the elements you're building in the wrong way. And in fact, when she asked, Daphne invited me to speak to potential funders last year, and I had to tell her I couldn't do it. I didn't think that she was taking the right approach, and I didn't think she was listening to many of the people that are doing the work day in and day out.
Lita, you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. With regards to what Mr. Vanek said about raising the sentencing, what I can tell you from speaking with victims is that one of their greatest fear, and from my own daughter's statement as well as many others, is the fear of the trafficker, you know, being able to get out of jail and, you know, find the victims. These girls are what you call, they go through a grooming process, and they're somewhat like brainwashed. So these traffickers really have these girls, you know, have them controlled. Some people ask the question, well, why, you know, if they're walking the street, why don't they just run? It's not that easy. So with the greater sentencing, what that does is that, I'll tell you this, I know a case where a pimp was sentenced. He pimped and beat and raped a young lady. Well, with regards to pimping and pandering, let me clarify this. 90%, and I'll say on 100%, but the majority of the girls are beaten. Most of them who are under the ages of 18 are raped. According to California law, anyone under the age of 18 does not have consent to have sex. So if they're under the age of 18, I work with a lot of underage kids, so, you know, that's my focus. It's rape every time. On an average daily, these girls are seeing anywhere between 20 to 30 clients. There's a quota that they have to bring in. So the girls are afraid, and this is speaking from the girls' perspective. I would like to be their voice today, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are being victimized. They are the ones that are experiencing the torture and just the degrading as a human being. They are saying, if this guy has pimped and trafficked me, and he only does 17 months in jail, he's beat me, he's raped me, a lot of these girls are kidnapped. You know, all types of things. Gang rapes are going on. They're taken from their families. They're teenagers who are not getting an education. So to slap, I did a little research last night, and I also interviewed a few pimps in the last week just to see, you know, their perspective. And pimps can be bold sometimes. And with regards to pimping, you know, and pandering, their motto is, you know, they really don't get arrested. The girls are the ones who get arrested. I'm just going to keep it real with you. Most of the time, the girls are getting arrested. So the pimps are getting arrested, for one. For two, they're not getting a lot of time. For one reason, it's because the victims are so afraid of these pimps and they're so brainwashed that they're not willing to come forth and testify. And even if they do testify, the trauma that they're put through during sentencing. I was there for a trial with a 13-year-old victim, which was in a public forum such as this. In normal juvenile courts, the public is not allowed in the court. But this 13-year-old child who had been beaten and pimped and tortured had to sit on a stand in front of the public and against this pimp who posted $1 million bill. And I have to just continue to speak on that, because I'm thinking he posted $1 million bill, but my family and I had to become homeless, and he gets to sit on the other side. He was convicted of over 35 years, and I am happy to say that. But that's not the average case. The average case here is that pimps are just slapped on the wrist. And what Prop 35 represents is that we're not taking it anymore. You will not pimp and traffic our children and young girls, or even boys are being affected and men are being affected by this issue. You will not do that anymore. If we catch you, you know, pimping and pandering these dudes, this is what you'll get. And what that does, and what I've seen, is that instead of pimps saying, well, you know, we don't get caught anyway, and, you know, they're not really doing it, I'll just bail out, and, you know, this and this, and they think that we as a community, we as service providers, law enforcement, legislature, they really think that we're a joke. So what Prop 35 does is it brings awareness not only to the community, but it brings awareness to these pimps and traffickers to let them know that we will not tolerate this anymore. You understand what I'm saying? And I kind of feel, although I am, you know, working in human trafficking, but as a citizen and as a parent, when it comes to politics and attorneys and things like that, I feel that they are looking at the situation from a legal perspective, from what's written. They don't understand the pain that we as families go through. It's not always just the girl. Families are impacted by this. Communities are impacted by this. And so I have this great passion because I truly believe that if traffickers know that they will not get a slap on the wrist, it will raise an eyebrow to them. No, it won't solve all problems, but it will let them know and send out a clear statement that you will go to jail for a very long time. And that gives us time to work with these young ladies. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's great. And I'm going to ask Chris to chime in right now, but I want the audience to sort of think a little bit about what kind of questions they might want to also ask after this dialogue.
This is meant to be transformational. This is meant to say to law enforcement, line law enforcement, to prosecutors, you should be going after the traffickers and not the victims in these cases. We get a little bit of resistance from some in the prosecutorial community who are very comfortable with the prostitution bus that flow through their offices. But we've had a number of progressive DAs step up and aggressively support Prop 35, including Jeff Rosen in Santa Clara County, where John was law enforcement for years, Jim Wagstaff in San Mateo County, Nancy O'Malley, who's been a leader of this in Alameda County. You know, we've got some good progressive law enforcement backing and people that we've been in discussions with over the years, that some who are opposing Prop 35 have tried to say that they're the only experts out there. We spend a lot of time with a lot of different experts, including Delita and people who've experienced this themselves. We wanted to make a radical change, and that's one of the reasons when Daphne and I first met, we're like, well, do we go back to the legislature, join forces again? And we said no, because this is a legislature that over the last 5 years that she and Charmaine have been trying, over the last couple of years that I've been trying on the internet piece of this, they want to do little piecemeal things that they can put out a press release on. Like, that's what moves politics in Sacramento right now. We wanted to actually make a difference on the streets, and that's why we have Prop 35.
Okay, so I would just like to respond to a couple things. First off, I got to tell you that after 25 years in law enforcement, handling a variety of types of of cases to be, and I know Delita was not, hopefully not speaking to me personally, but to be lumped in that law enforcement doesn't care about victims. That's just not the case. And I work with an awful lot of people who really care about people. I work with a lot of victim service providers who really care about people. And we could sit here and talk, you know, like a case per case, by case by case. Criminal cases are very easily taken out of context and not the victimization that occurs. Every day, throughout the world, people are being victimized in heinous ways. And many of us, I mean, we all want the same thing here. Everybody here wants the same thing. We want less victimization, less pain and suffering in our communities. But when we look at how we approach that, we have to ask ourselves, is this the best way to do it? I would ask you to just reflect, what agenda would I have in being opposed to this? I never thought I would be opposing legislation to help victims of human trafficking. And when we politicize things through the initiative process, it can become, one, very emotional, and two, place a tremendous burden on the voters. Because if there wasn't concerns, then why would Community Solutions, who is the victim service provider in Morgan Hill and serves trafficking and sexual assault and domestic violence victims throughout the South Bay, take a public stance in opposition to Prop 35? An organization called SAGE, many of you might be familiar with SAGE, stands for Stand Against Global Exploitation, one of the first human trafficking specific victim services organizations in San Francisco, founded by Norma Hotelling, a victim of the commercial sex trade. Originally endorsed Prop 35, just this past Monday, their board voted to rescind that endorsement, and they notified Daphne via email Monday night. The Bill Wilson Center, which takes care of youth victims in the Santa Clara County area, is opposed. And we also have to understand when this politicization happens, we have to sort of read between the lines sometimes and ask ourselves, particularly in a highly emotional case like this, who is not taking any position? Because when we look at organizations like the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking here in Los Angeles, at the forefront of legislative action in California, they've chosen not to take a position, and they've been quoted as having concerns about Prop 35. The Polaris Project, a national organization but works individually in states here in California, they've chosen not to take a position. Do you understand how difficult it is for any organization to come out and say, I oppose something that is helping human trafficking victims? It's because they look at the deeper issues and they realize it's just not the best way. We're not saying we don't need to improve some things. We're not saying we don't need to move forward. I'll tell you right now, we absolutely need to raise awareness amongst law enforcement. So there's 2 hours of training. Don't think that's enough, personally. But you know what? When law enforcement investigates and take it to the DAs, and the DAs are like, well, what's human trafficking? I'm sorry, there are many district attorneys, prosecutors, the prosecutors who don't understand that there's Penal Code 236.1 on the books, has been since 2006. It defines human trafficking and it lays out the elements of the crime. Judges don't know. And one of the biggest problems that lies in the way of prosecution is that the public doesn't know. Because ultimately the public is going to be a jury in a criminal trial. So, I mean, there's all these complexities. I've done many things in law enforcement in 25 years, and I have to tell you, this is the most complex issue, in my opinion, that exists in American law enforcement today. We have a lot of work to do, but we need to be very careful about it.
I'll have Chris just respond to that, and then I'll open it up for questions.
I do think it's really unfortunate when things get politicized. And this is actually, I think, at the end of the day, a simple issue. And having a comprehensive strategy that has some increased penalties, not unbelievably draconian at the end of the day. All they do is match federal penalties on sentences. Some increased fines because there is an economic root to this and we want to aggressively deter it. with those fines going substantially to victim services and to law enforcement retraining. So we changed this culture that's operating. And politicization happens because this is real change. There's been a lot of misinformation thrown out there, not so much by John, but by a whole bunch of other opponents who deliberately misread the statutory text, who try to say that it does things that it doesn't even come close to doing, that it doesn't do anything for victims at all. That's what you're hearing from a few organizations right now. But if you look at Missy or Wind River Services or the organizations that we worked with to help put this together, they come out and they rebut whenever some new organization that's been asked to come off or not to say anything does that. We're really proud of what we're doing here because it actually will make real change. And that's, I think, a good indicator of the process. It is getting politicized because we're actually going to make people do things differently. I'm perfectly comfortable with that.
I'd like to take a question from the audience. And please identify yourself and stand.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm a freshman here, political science major. I want to start first by thanking you guys for speaking, especially your powerful testimony. This is like the most interesting panel I've been to at USC. But my question relates specifically to the wording of the bill. Like, how does California state law define human trafficking? Specifically, does it encompass sex trafficking and labor trafficking? And under this law, would labor traffickers who haven't necessarily engaged in sexual abuse be forced to register as sex offenders?
Yeah, I mean, it's force, fraud, or coercion, sort of obtaining services through force, fraud, or coercion. And no, you won't have to, sort of labor traffickers will not have to register as sex offenders. That's one of the lies that's been spread here, is that there's no statutory interpretation you could come up with. And it's a little confusing because you have to, when you write an initiative, you have to amend certain sections. And but we did this very carefully, and that's that's one of the sort of most aggressively false things that's been spread about the initiative.
You want to move on?
Oh, this gentleman here, and then right over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Lester Duncan. As someone who works on both policy and also works very closely with survivors and victims, I wanted to ask about your point regarding restitution. Seeing some of these cases firsthand, do you really think that it's practical that someone, that a victim that's looking at their pimp and realizes that this pimp can post $1 million bail and will most likely only get a couple of months or a couple of years in jail time, do you really think it's practical that these victims would post charges or seek restitutions from these traffickers, knowing the threat that they face with this trafficker coming back out with only a couple of years if Prop 35 wasn't to pass?
That's a great question, because you touch on a couple things. I'm sorry, your first name was? Lester. Thank you very much. So first off, I think that what we have to do is ask the victims. Okay, what do they want? And professional victim service providers understand that. We practice a national philosophy, and it's actually a law, refers to a victim-centered response, where the needs and the desires of the victims come first, even ahead of law enforcement. But what I can tell you is that I think they do move forward in civil judgments against their traffickers, because the vast majority of cases that have been awarded under both federal and federal law in California, in federal court, but also in state court, have been in cases where there has not been any criminal prosecution. So those are already occurring. And the service providers who do that work know how to balance that need for restitution and trying to create a sense of wholeness for victims and survivors, excuse me. So yes, it does work. And I don't, understand too that in a criminal court, the burden of proof for a criminal prosecution is much higher than in civil court. That's why we try and place the victim first, and we understand that. So from the perspective of my colleagues who do service work, the attorneys who represent them, the concern here is that if there's only a small pool of money, whatever that pool of money, maybe it's $1 million, maybe it's no money, right? But once somebody is convicted in criminal court, if the judge were to say, okay, you know, you have to pay the victim for their hours worked, and then there's going to be another piece of fine, and 30% goes here and 70% goes here. Civil actions cannot occur until, you know, they get delayed until after criminal action is finished. And at that point, if we have taken money and sent it to the state, is that money then going to be available for that victim to come back and say, wait a minute, now I also want 3 times my labored wages. I want additional funds for pain and suffering. And those are the concerns that my colleagues who are doing this work have. You know what,
Yeah,
actually, I do.
Yeah, I mean, have there only been 20 cases of trafficking in the last 6 years then?
No.
I mean,
No. What I was saying is that, and again, I reached out on Sunday night to about 4 civil attorneys, and I've come up with about 20 cases, and some of the damages have been, you know, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay, I understand there's a lot of work going on that you just don't see. There's a lot of work that goes on that doesn't make the press. All right, so please don't think that this work is not being done in California, because it is. And if we want to talk about criminal cases, we've had about 80 convictions for the actual human trafficking section, 236.1, in California since 2006.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Liz. I'm a junior in International Relations, and I want to thank you all for coming to our campus. This is very exciting. When I first was told about Proposition 35, my immediate reaction was this was another attempt to arrest more independent escorts, as we see when we talk about cases with Backpage.com and that kind of thing. And as a former independent escort and someone who is good friends with some people who work as independent escorts, I want to make sure that there are no provisions in Proposition 35 that would hurt independent escorts. If you guys have any feelings about decriminalizing prostitution one day, but I also especially want to thank Lita, because I'm sure we had very different experiences, and I so rarely get to hear about your side of things.
I'm not in favor of decriminalization over time, but that's also clearly not the target of Prop 35. Yeah, it's, I mean, force, fraud, and coercion. Yeah. I think it's highly unlikely that you'll see prosecutions focused on, you know, independent activity. It just doesn't fit the statute. Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that gets thrown about in talking about the drafting of the statute, you also have to remember how, you know, criminal laws are construed strictly by courts as well. So the likelihood that some outrageous reading could be given to this, you know, it depends on 2 things. One is a breach of prosecutorial ethics to overreach with a statute that they know doesn't apply here, and 2 is a judge willing to go along with that. And I just don't see that being a serious, you know, possibility.
And I would agree with everything Chris just said.
Yeah. Delita, did you want to?
Thank you. And one thing is that as a survivor, I was more of an independent escort as well. Being a survivor, I had my first kid when I was very young, so I began the life of a sex worker at the age of 15 years old. So I believe that's where the victimization came in. But until my daughter was victimized, I didn't realize that there was a separation between, you know, people who are sex trafficked and, you know, volunteer escorts. So I feel, and I asked the same question that you did, you know what I mean? And again, in order to have a case of human trafficking or sex trafficking, there has to be force, fraud, or coercion. When it comes to independent escorts, you know, we're doing this on our own. We're voluntarily doing this. So those elements do not exist unless you are a minor, which there's no need for force, fraud, or coercion. So,
And I should just say, the work that our center does is specifically and only deals with the intersection of technology and human trafficking with regard to forced product coercion or sex trafficking of minors. Any other? Yes.
My name is Stephanie. I'm in the Masters of Public Diplomacy program. I'd like to, again, second everybody's opinions. Thank you all for being here. This is clearly a very emotional issue, and everybody here is very passionate about it. One of the concerns that has been raised is that a ballot measure is difficult to change, and that evolution and progress would be difficult for a very complex issue. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
This is why we put in the ballot initiative language saying that it can be amended by a majority vote of the legislature consistent with the initiative. So the legislature cannot go back and, given that this has gotten somewhat politicized, if there are attempts by the legislature to undermine it, we will fight them. But if anything consistent with the purposes of the statute can be handled by a majority vote of the legislature.
Other questions?
If I could just add on to that, Mark. So there was some confusion. I had some confusion about that. I've learned an awful lot about California's proposition law and process, initiative process, the last few months.
Me too. This is the first time I've done this. So,
and I've spent more time talking to attorneys in the last 3 months than I did probably 25 years of law enforcement. But yes, we can change elements that are put in place as a result of the initiative. And I can tell you that there are already attorneys who work in Sacramento who are looking at this and are already preparing to work to undo some elements of it should it be passed by the voters.
And we'll be happy to fight them aggressively.
So one other question here, then maybe
Great.
a round of closing statement.
Well, Ballot, you said that you wanted to be the voice of the kids who we don't get to hear from a lot, so I just wanted to give you an opportunity. Is there anything that you've learned in the last few weeks? Are the kids you're working with aware of Prop 35? Do they feel they need it? Do they feel it's useless? Like, how do they feel?
Yes, the kids are knowledgeable. I had a conversation with a group of young ladies yesterday, and I was very shocked on their response. And I would like to clarify that as victims and as the voice for victims and myself, I do think that there are law enforcement officers out there who really care about this issue. Most children that I've talked to are aware, they are aware of human trafficking, and they have two views as children. The first is, well, will Prop 35 help me when, I was kidnapped and put on the street, but when officers, when I came in contact with officers, I was arrested, handcuffs were put on me, and I was treated like a criminal. How will Prop 35 help me? And that's something that wasn't brought up and I would like to address. With regards to law enforcement training. Even the contact that I had on both of my cases with law enforcement, they were not trained. They did not know how to handle the situation at first. Now, there are law enforcement officers who are knowledgeable of human trafficking, so they're handling the situation. But mandating law enforcement officers to take training and to understand that these girls are victims. So when they come in contact with them, and this is like the girls' main purpose, is we don't want to, we are victims. All these terrible things happen to us, but when we come in contact with law enforcement who's supposed to be there to protect and serve, we're treated like criminals. We're looked down upon. I was interviewed at 1 o'clock in the morning on the streets of Compton on a curb after my daughter had been rescued from being kidnapped and trafficked. So it is very important, and that's, one of the girls' main concerns as far as Prop 35, but they are educating themselves upon this issue.
The greatest pleasure for me in this experience in putting things together has been working with the victims directly and hearing their stories, and that's why we've focused so much on them on the website, on prop35.org, where you can see the victims' stories and what's gone on, and have a number of the victims talking about what the initiative change will mean to them. and the statement that we're making as a state that we're actually not going to kind of get caught up in bureaucratic processes, that we're going to help retrain law enforcement to focus on the real victims here. And we think that that's a great opportunity for this state. Unfortunately, sometimes things do get politicized, and people start throwing around things, and what we're looking for is a better comprehensive strategy. Prop 35 is it. It's been very well considered. It's been very well put together. It addresses, as President Obama stressed in his anti-sex trafficking, anti-human trafficking speech, both an online and an offline component. It's very well crafted to address these things with some increased penalties that match federal law, so it's not like this isn't happening already on some levels. We want more resources to go to that prosecution and to collect more fines so that we can actually redistribute the money that the traffickers are making to victim services and to law enforcement training. And we want to change a couple of rules that don't make sense. We want to harmonize state law with federal law and make sure that we're not so out of step anymore. So there's a real opportunity here for California voters to stand up and step forward for a lot of these victims on the streets. It is a straightforward proposition, which is why it's been endorsed by Senator Boxer and Senator Feinstein and the California Democratic Party, the California Republican Party, by all these different groups who have looked at it 20 ways from Sunday. And there are a few dissenters, and we're okay with dissenters, but we want to make sure that we're really pulling for victim services, and that's what Prop 35 will do.
So I would ask you, I think maybe up here somewhere, unfortunately, there's no money to give our voice. We have a free blog, noonprop35.wordpress.com. Can't be late for the Giants game. So please visit, because you'll hear some other voices and you'll find some more information. They have an impressive list of endorsers. And, but yet I've talked to some of these endorsers, and one being the office of U.S. Representative Jackie Speer. They did not seek input from anybody other than California Against Slavery. And maybe they should have. We also didn't get a chance to touch on the conflation here of, or the confusion between sex and labor trafficking. Prop 35 does create a different sentencing standard for sex trafficking versus labor trafficking. I personally believe that we should not place one type of victim ahead of another type of victim. Sex is often used to control people who are forced to do other types of labor. That's a broad philosophical question. And for those of us that work at the national level, we struggle to keep that parity. Understand that individual cases are all charged and prosecuted on their individual merits. So we have to be careful when we say this sentencing happens here and this sentencing happens here. Also, please understand that under current California law, and should Prop 35 pass, human trafficking is not a prison mandatory sentencing crime, which is a hard thing to explain. I'm happy to talk about when we're offline here. You can be convicted of human trafficking right now and not go to prison. And that will not change under Prop 35. That is something that would have been exceptionally meaningful change in California. I would ask you to think about two things. Again, coming back, what agenda would I have? What agenda would the professional service providers have who are opposed? And if any are opposed, we should at least stop and ask ourselves why. The final thing I'll leave you with is this, is, talking to a lot of people, getting a lot of emails, and people say, hey, well, you know what? What if we just want to pass something? We want to do something to feel like we are taking a stand for human trafficking victims in California, and this is our opportunity. This is our chance. I'm like, well, that's right. This is your chance. But ask yourself, are you voting for this proposition so you feel good, or because you actually think it is going to make our response better? And if you believe it really does make the response better, then God bless you. Vote for it. But if you have questions and you wonder why professionals have questions, but you're voting for it because you want to feel good, you just might want to reconsider that. And thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mark.
You know, what I'm convinced of is even though some of the panelists might have different ways, I mean, everyone on this panel have different approaches to addressing the problem of human trafficking, and it's a very real problem. I'm convinced that everyone sort of is drawing from the same sort of compassion and willingness to actually do something about this issue. Now, let me just ask one question of the audience. So now you're transported back into the voter booth, and now it's time for you to vote yes or no on Prop 35. You don't have to tell me what you're going to vote. But did this conversation, raise your hand if this conversation helped you learn a little bit more about this proposition. Okay, with that, I thank you very much. Jeff, do you want to?
Thank you very much. Next week, there's going to be another program. Kirsten, do we know what the program is for the White House or Aubrey?
Swing vote.
Swing vote. Swing vote. And then election night out here in the quad. Please thank Mark.